Friends, welcome back to Leading Theologically. I am your host, Bill Davis. It is my pleasure to serve as the Senior Director for Theological Education Funds Development at the Presbyterian Foundation, where I get to work with the Committee on Theological Education of the PCUSA. And it is two members of that committee that are joining me today for our conversation about training leaders for smaller churches. And so I want to welcome the Reverend Dr. Beth McCaw. Reverend Dr. Yes? Yes, okay. The Reverend Dr. Beth McCaw from the University of Dubuque Theological Seminary, and the Reverend Shelli Latham from the Omaha Presbyterian Seminary Foundation. Beth and Shelli, welcome to Leading Theologically.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you. Good company.
So why don't we jump right in? We are talking today about training leaders in smaller churches and congregations. And so as a means of introduction and kind of talking about how you come to this subject for our listeners, what drew you to focus on leadership formation for smaller churches? Beth, you're in the academy at the University of Dubuque. Why don't you start us off today?
Thank you. Yes, this is really where my home is these days. Across my life and ministry, I've been involved in many different forms and sizes of churches and congregational life. But I've developed a real soft spot for when I've been in smaller communities. So for a while, my husband and I were living and working in rural Namibia. And then at another time, I was part of a small house church of 6 or 7 families. And then for a while, I was bivocational, serving largely smaller congregations in rural Montana, and was really deeply appreciative and moved by the creativity and hope and freedom that some of those small congregations have. And in a time when there's an epidemic of loneliness or disengagement, I think small churches can have special promise for pulling people together and nurturing folks holistically.
That's beautiful. Thanks, Beth. Shelli, what about you? What draws you to this work?
Sure. So the organizational context of the Omaha Presbyterian Seminary Foundation kind of thrust me into this context. OPSF was originally founded as a seminary in the 1890s, which was to serve the frontier between McCormick and San Francisco. So a lot of wide open spaces and small towns and thriving and not thriving congregations that are small really from the beginning. And while now small church ministry is a reality and there's this need for leadership formation for small churches across our country, I think it's still probably the most true that there is a vast difference between a vast distance between churches and small communities and churches in the areas that we serve across the Rockies and the Plains. So our churches have been living this reality for a really long time in small towns and far spread apart from one another. But the reality is that this is shaping our ministries and churches across the denomination. And so it's exciting to be doing something that's really relevant and to think about serving church at all means that we've got to really begin to think about nurturing churches and the leaders who are in small congregations.
That's beautiful. Thanks, Shelli. So when we think about training a leader for a church and for a smaller church, what are some of the assumptions that a traditional seminary, a traditional MDiv leadership program might be making? And then what are some of the realities that these leaders get into the churches and face today? Shelli, you're doing some really creative certificate programming right now. Yeah, you and I were in seminary together. I want to get that disclaimer out of the way quickly. So when I talk about our seminary education, we got trained for some assumptions about the church. What are some of the assumptions that trainers of leaders for small churches are making today?
So I don't know if it's an assumption or if it's just that we haven't caught up to the reality that we know is the
Mm,
reality, but we haven't figured out how to do theological education for the current reality. I
hmm,
think the Master of Divinity trajectory is the gold standard for ministry preparation really is changing. Like at the
hmm,
time when I was going into seminary, there was we wouldn't have called it a pipeline, but thriving youth ministries nurtured people who went on to be curious about ministry. And then they went to college and then came out of college and went to seminary. And now we just have a really different trajectory into theological education. A lot of times that's happening later in life. Beth and I
hmm,
were in a conversation a couple of years ago where someone used the language of the holy tap, like you get the holy
hmm,
tap and it sort of nudges you into ministry. And I think it's happening differently now that people see a vacuum and an opportunity and they think, could this be mine to step into? And now they're constrained geographically, constrained financially and time wise, but eager to serve. And we haven't necessarily entirely caught up to equipping people where they are for the ministry that they could be doing right now. And so I think just our assumptions about what vocational discernment
hmm,
looks like sometimes leaves us a step behind being able to readily equip the people who are receiving a call to ministry, which may not be the whole full package.
hmm.
I'm going to jump in right now and pastor a church call.
Yeah, that's helpful, Shelli. Beth, where do you see assumptions being made from your perspective at Dubuque?
Um, the greatest assumption that I run into, and not necessarily at Dubuque, but when I'm out in the church, is that we're teaching in the way that we did 30 years ago. So
Hmm,
I'll run into pastors who will say, seminary did not prepare this me for this. Then I'll say, good news. We're not teaching in the way that we did 30 years as we did 30 years ago when you went to seminary.
hmm,
That we've kept a pace with very new and fresh forms of what church is. And Shelli's mentioned already, there used to be this assumption that there's a very particular path toward ministry for certain people of a distinctive call experience who then are sent out in a U-Haul 36 months after they start school.
hmm.
Um, and that is such a small fraction of how it works these days. Most of our learners are already in ministry, and
Yeah.
we're training them in place in the laboratory of their local contacts and
Hmm,
making assumptions about bivocational ministry
hmm,
and the ministry across the pews. I think was a great era in which the glory days of the professionalization of ministry, if you
yeah.
will, right? The full-time MDiv clergy person installed, the main hired staff person for a church who ran the church. And in a way that is sort of fraying now. I think there's a great hope of a better ecclesiology and
Hmm,
restoring ministry to the full breadth of God's people. And so in our programs, we're sort of assuming much more flexibility and a more interesting context
hmm.
for people who are being trained and formed for their vocations.
Yeah. I like that, right? And Beth, I really appreciate this about you naming that you are training people in their context, right? You do a lot of distance learning at Dubuque. Um, I joked with folks when I first moved to Denver, Colorado 13 years ago that my degrees from Columbia Seminary and Candler School of Theology did not prepare me to pastor a church in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains
Yes.
with this Buddhist influence coming out of Boulder and with this glory of creation surrounding us and people going skiing more often than not in the winter and all of that. So I wonder about what is essential today for a small church leader. If you could redesign a theological education uh, trajectory, and y'all are doing this in some ways at Dubuque and Omaha, what would be essential for a small church leader? What skills are they most needing today, Beth? Where would you start?
Um, so even in asking the question of how would you redesign, there's
Hmm.
something implicit there in terms of building a capacity to always be redesigning, right?
Yeah.
That
Yes.
reformed, always reforming, that we're building capacities to be flexible and responsive, not in a little sprint for a moment, but as a way of life. The church needs
Hmm.
to be nimble and responsive right now. And
Hmm.
so even just how we approach education for ministry is a reflection of what also needs to be happening in ministry for the church today.
Hmm.
Within that, one of the things that I really love is the great ends of the church.
Hmm.
I think it's one
Yeah.
of the wondrous gifts to the world, to the church around the globe and of different traditions, but it's one of our gifts um, because there's something very anchored in the faith, but also very transcendent and
Hmm.
flexible in the forms in which we can express that. And
Hmm.
so, if we can form our learners in a way that they appreciate the gift of this gospel, of this tradition, but also sense a lot of freedom and have a trained muscle memory for being creative and leaning into how to interpret that for the church today, that will serve us for the long haul and that will serve us in multiple contexts.
Hmm. Yeah. Shelli, what are y'all doing at Omaha around these essential capacities?
So before jumping into what specifically we're doing at OPSF, I think one of the things that to me is helpful for us to acknowledge, and is also it's pretty fun and exciting time in
Mm,
congregational ministry, even while being really scary,
Mhm.
because we have long, you know, proclaimed that we believe in the priesthood of all believers, and
mm,
now we are in a time where like the rubber meets the road. Now we need an equipped laity.
mm,
We need all the gifts of the people who are in our congregations. And that's a real growing edge for
mm,
OPSF. We have identified that we need to be moving forward in a way that acknowledges, the knowledge and the passion and the capacity for lay leaders in congregations. And even the term lay leader, I know, is very
mm,
limited. But how can we um, be helping people as they're just discerning some sense of call, not even sure what it is, and validating this sense of call before it's fully fleshed out. So we've
mm,
recently launched our certificate in proclamation, which is a 4-course online, partially asynchronous, partially in a peer learning group that happens
mhm,
virtually, that just says, hey, are you curious about how you live out the word in worship and live in the word in worship? Well, come learn about it. And then we equip people for engaging scripture in worship, and reformed theology, and practicing homiletics within, as Beth was saying, like we've got to do these things in the context in which these people are already in ministry and discovering ministry as they're learning. So that's one of the pieces. And then the other piece that I just keep coming back to is that we need to be equipping people for sustained ministry. And whether you are a minister of word and sacrament or a commissioned pastor or a committed congregation member, it can be a grind, a beautiful grind, but it can be long and hard and isolated. And when you're doing things for the glory of God, sometimes we put an immense amount of pressure on ourselves. And so equipping our leaders for their own internal journey through spiritual direction and coaching and peer learning groups and community, like anchoring people in communities of support. It doesn't sound like theological education, but we have to learn how to care for ourselves as these agents for and disciples for Christ's glory. And I think, like Beth was saying, the muscle memory of how do you develop spiritual practices that are going to sustain you in ministry is so incredibly important.
Yeah.
Bill, if I can underscore
Please.
Shelli's point about the whole body of Christ. So a number of us church entities and schools are stewarding Lilly grants, and there's some for seminaries and some for pastors. But one that I'm directing is a Thriving Congregations grant, and the title of it is Plentiful Gifts. And the thesis behind it is there is great wealth across the pews in a 25-member church, because there are 25 members of the body of Christ. And I've often thought it's such a luxury, the preparation for ministry process, and in which we take somebody who may be heading to seminary and we surround them with a discernment circle and we say, what do you need to nurture your call? Every child of God deserves to have that. And if we do that across the body of Christ, it becomes very exciting what is possible for the flourishing of the church, and small churches have high levels of engagement. That's exciting to me. And also, I think if we do that well, we prevent burning out the one paid person in the room, right? Instead of just training one person and delegating to them running the church, boy, that's a recipe to sink under a load with the changing shapes of church leadership. But if we equip the whole body of church, so even in our curriculum, we say, how can you not go be number one on everybody's speed dial? But how can you help everybody be calling each other? And so I think this is really critical. And that's one of the things I really appreciate with Shelli, that vision for equipping the whole body of Christ to great joy and freedom.
Yeah, so I love this, and I'm going to shift some of the language that I even sent y'all, because so Catherine Neely Burton and I had this conversation a few weeks ago to frame what this looks like, and we talked about pastoral imagination and what that looks like. But I'm even wondering if the word pastoral is so loaded in this conversation that what we're really talking about is a leadership imagination. And what are some of the spiritual practices that ground a leader so that they're able to respond in real time with this creative relationality that's present in a smaller church? So let's talk about spiritual practices, some that are sustaining leaders, what are y'all seeing as being so important for leaders to be grounded in creatively, spiritually, so that they're able to live in the church these days?
So, Bill, I'll take it even one step further.
Please.
We had a program we called Congregational Leadership Program. And it also was handy that it was CLP, right? When we used to have CLPs, but now we have CREs or commissioned pastors. About 3 years ago, we overhauled our program. And one of the things I realized when I was visiting with a presbytery for an ordination, and I was sharing about that program, is someone was very interested in growing in their ministry, but they said, oh no, I don't want to be a pastor. Oh no, I'm not a leader. I'm just. And there's a problem with the just, right?
Yes.
And so we changed the name of the whole program to Congregational Equipping Program. And sometimes folks, once they start to nurture one facet of their gifts and vocation, they discover I have greater gifts than I realize and greater interests. So I think even there, even with leadership, we need leaders. Leaders need to lead, and we need clergy and we need pastors. But I also think sometimes we find our way to those roles and we strengthen other roles by having expansive language for all those baptized into the community. And then I'm really a fan, and I think the research is showing this is buffering for resilience in ministry and life to have established spiritual practices and disciplines that resonate with who we are and how we are wired. So I could go through, prayer and Sabbath or pilgrimage, what works for individual people. But you mentioned the word imagination, and I think right now that is such a critical capacity to develop and even something to exercise very deliberately. I love the language in our ordination vows with energy, intelligence, imagination, and love. And sometimes I think folks think, oh, imagination, there's a sort of whimsical one. No, this is such a serious capacity. And as I work with small churches, I'm concerned that people's imaginations and congregations' imaginations are almost wholly consumed with nostalgia and grief. They're using their powers for envisioning things to measure against what they remember, and that eclipses what could be possible. And so we need to do our grief work and learn to exercise the imagination in a very deliberate way to recognize where life is springing up and what could be in the next chapter. And I think that's almost a spiritual practice that the church needs to support. And we're starting to do that with storytelling, for example. But I think even exercising the imagination is a practice that's needed right now.
Thanks for that, Beth. Shelli, where are some of the practices that you see leaders being grounded in your context?
So I like me personally, spiritual practices have been a growing edge for me. And I think that is the case for a lot of our leaders who are trained in, have pretty heady theological training, that we're not always so comfortable with spiritual practices. For me personally, embodied practices, which sort of anchor my whole self in the presence of God. So breath work, movement, it used to be running, and but a way for me to, breathe in the God's good air and experience the nurturing of the earth. But I think that as you're looking at, I mean, for me, or if you're looking at people who are engaged in ministry, that we have to build these practices into our daily life of ministry, and not necessarily, there are some people who are very gifted at parceling out their time to light a candle and do reflection. But there are ways also that our preaching preparation can be a spiritual discipline. And so how do we anchor ourselves in the things that we already have to do and treat them as a gift, as a way to be engaged with God? Backstory preaching is doing great things with worship preparation as a spiritual discipline. Our own camp offering that we do around worship preparation is looking this year at how do you create a life-giving practice of cultivating worship. When you look at, I've been rereading Barbara Brown Taylor's An Altar in the World, and she talks about how you take ordinary tasks, the sights and the smells and the sounds that are around you, and find God in those. And I think there's a resurgence in connecting with the mystics, and there's something really incredibly beautiful about this. But there's also something that is beautiful in saying that the things that you have are around you all the time, and how do we start paying attention to God's presence amongst us with purpose.
Yeah. Right. So I love the intersection of what the two of y'all are saying here, right? Because Beth, you're talking about a grief around nostalgia. And Shelli, you're talking about paying attention to what's around us. And I think both of those, when we talk about cultivating practices of imagination, acknowledging a past, yet looking forward to the future is the space where imagination lives for me. Right. So I wonder, as we look at maybe a nostalgia of what a small church used to be in a rural setting or an urban setting with a pastor and 25 members, to part of what our colleague Catherine Neely Burton calls an unpastored future, right? Where some of these churches might not have pastors. What gives you hope about the future of small church ministry these days?
So I'm really hopeful about small church ministry. I have my own career trajectory is that I
Yeah.
served very large congregations, and then I served a quite small congregation.
Mm-hmm.
And I will tell you that the skills and the gifts and the things that I had to work with within myself in the smaller were harder, but the
Mm-hmm.
engagement of the congregation every day in the work of caring for one another and creating beautiful things in worship and engaging our community, like that wasn't happening through me. That was happening through the congregational leaders and volunteers, and I am pretty jazzed about that. Like I think that we are in a time in which we can really take seriously that, the churches that have had like, you are now entering your mission field. Well, yes, it's true. And or that we are all ministers. Well, it's not lip service. We are. And if we can equip our congregations to believe that about themselves, to trust that God has a place and a purpose for them. These tiny churches are doing amazing things with incredibly limited resources, like the 2 fish and 5 loaves, or whatever the order of those is. That's what's happening now. Like whole soup kitchens thriving out of churches that just have they see a need and they see an opportunity, and they're doing it. And so I'm impassioned by small church ministry. And a lot of our churches, like there is a lot of loss, but there are a lot of churches that have been small for a long time and have been
That's
doing
right.
really great things for a long time. And it's a, I think it is a hopeful time if we can, like Beth is saying, like stop looking backwards and embrace the opportunity that is before us and really live into it.
Mm-hmm.
So with Shelli, I've had stops, and my first call installed was in a larger program church. But interestingly enough, my role in that was, as we received new members, one of the first things about which I had concern was to find a small circle in which for them to find their people, right? So it was the choir or the young adult, Sunday school class, or like one of the very first impulses is to find a circle of 12 or 20. And when I was ministering bivocationally in Western Montana, I could walk into church, 25 people, and I didn't have to fill out the pew tab for somebody mail me something in 2 weeks. I was just surrounded. It was walking into somebody's kitchen, right? And you join the family. So small churches do that well. But I also really like, I think that some churches, as they've gotten smaller and needed to flex to find new ways to be themselves, they've necessarily been freed from old models of what must constitute being a real church. You must have a chancel choir, you must have a 2-week VBS, you must have a half-time this person and that person. They are freed from that. And when I was ministering in Western Montana, I was just fascinated to see what different small churches were just making up, like what works. What is our mission? And maybe we don't run these 3 programs that you think every church has to run. Instead, we're doing that. It completely unique. Small churches are highly contextual, and each one is very unique. And I'm inspired by that. I would witness these small churches and think, I never thought of that. I never thought of that. And I can go to a number of program churches and probably say, I recognize that Sunday school class. I recognize that summer programming. But I would go to these little churches and thought, I have never seen anything like that before. And in a way, I think all of the churches can learn from smaller churches who are leaning into great inventiveness. And there can be small churches for whom it's a scary time and there's grief work to do. But there are others who are leaning forward and saying, what works now to bear this life-giving gospel in our neighborhood, in our little community? And I'm very inspired by those models.
That's a good word. And I want to take us to a final question as our time starts to wrap up today. And this has been an enriching conversation for me, and I think for our listeners as well, as we think about how we train folks across church size, right? Right, y'all are doing this. And I want to ask you a question that I ask every guest, because we hear lots of things, whether they're podcasts. This time of year, we just got done all the sports announcing for March Madness. What is the best thing that you have heard lately?
I'll go. I was having a conversation just yesterday with Helen Blyer. She's the director of the Center of Lifelong Learning at Columbia Theological Seminary. And we were talking about some collaboration opportunities between OPSF and Columbia, and about the things that we do well and pieces of things that other seminaries do well, and ways we could bring some of these things together. And she said, oh, it's like stone soup. And I've been carrying that metaphor with me, that many of our churches, they've always been small, and they're not feeling any sense of loss with that. And many are grieving the ways that things were and the stripping away of the past that seemed, like the harvest was more lush, but that all have something to offer. And maybe not all the ingredients to make their own pot of chili in house, but something special, like this unique witness to the good news of Jesus Christ. And I'm just feeling really compelled by that, like how together, like, holy moly, we can make some great soup, and it'll be messy and unexpected and beautiful, but it'll be nourishing, and it can be something that draws people together. And I'm just feeling pretty good about that.
Awesome. Beth, what have you heard good lately?
So with my deep desire to see especially small churches free from very restrictive understandings of forms of church to wide possibilities for the substance of church, right? That's where the life is the substance of the church, the faith we keep. I was on retreat a couple of times with small church members from the Presbytery of East Iowa. They're one of the participating judicatories in the grant I'm directing. And this is not an exact quote, but it was something along these lines. After them doing some of their exploratory work, one quote more or less was, oh, we realize who we are, and we are beautiful. And then another person was leaving and said, I did not realize, I'm going to go home and tell everybody at church, we are a cutting edge church. And we are on the front of what the church is becoming necessarily to serve the world. And my heart leapt. It was very beautiful.
Thank y'all for that testimony of beauty and these good things that you are hearing. And thank you for this conversation about the ways that we are equipping and wrestling with leaders in small churches for their formation, for the work that you do at Dubuque Seminary, at Dubuque University, and for the Omaha Foundation. Shelli and Beth, I give thanks for this conversation. So thank you.
Thank
This
you,
is a
Bill.
joy.
It's been a joy. It's very,
Awesome.
very fun.
Well, friends, this has been an episode of Leading Theologically, which is a ministry of the Presbyterian Foundation and the Theological Education Fund. You can find out more about us online at presbyterianfoundation.org/TEF. I hope you'll join us next time as my colleague Zoe Gary takes the baton for our next conversation about leadership in the small church. We'll see you then.